Day 3 of 31 Days of Comics narrows the field of focus for us a little bit, but that does not make it easier. But before we dive into that, in case you're not familiar with 31 Days of Comics, you can find the introductory Day 0 as well as Days 1 and 2 as part of this handy dandy playlist up here and in the description below. And with that out of the way, let's jump into today's prompt, which I'll not only be unpacking as usual, but also making slight adjustments to as we go along. Day 3 asks us for a great adaptation or remake. So first of all, an adaptation should be pretty easy to define. It is another version of something that already exists. And over here, because the waters can get a little murky and I have gone down a rabbit hole of confusion, I'm going to start eliminating things that are not adaptations. Right away, sequels and prequels I'm not counting as adaptations. Extensions of the original story, either forward or backward in time, are obviously based on previously existing material, but for me, no matter how much they're inspired or how much they borrow from the original work, for the purposes of this game, I'm not going to consider them adaptations. Similar to the ideas of sequels and prequels not counting as adaptations, anything that is loosely inspired by or set in the world of, anything that constitutes a new story in universe or canon, these are also things I would not consider adaptations for this game. Although obviously there's always going to be some sense of adapting original material when creating such kinds of works. So what eliminating these things points me towards is that an adaptation for me for this game has to be a work that is based on another discrete work. And I'm not going to be extremely strict about that single discrete work, by which I mean I can think of two books, say Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, being adapted together as an Adventures of Alice. But I do think I'm going to draw a line at a single work adapting 5 or 6 different works. This to me gets closer to the playing in the world of rather than adapting a singular work. And because selective cut and paste in many adaptations can get varied as far as their source of inspiration is concerned, I want to think of an adaptation as one work that is adapting one work. Over here, I also want to address the word remake as it appears in this prompt. I'm not at all saying that this is a universal definition, but for me, a remake is something that is in the same medium as the original. An adaptation could be in the same medium, but it could also be in another medium. So I wouldn't call the novelization of a movie script a remake of the movie, but I would consider another movie taking inspiration from the screenplay of an existing movie a remake of that. This does get a little complicated in comics, particularly when you're talking about in-continuity, generation-spanning comics, the kind of titles that Marvel and DC have been putting out for decades, because a remake or the reboot, the retcon, all of these words now confuse the issue of what is an adaptation of a singular work. And I don't necessarily feel I would classify a lot of these comics as adaptations, even though there is obviously work of adaptation involved. So, no sequels or prequels, no single works inspired by multiple works, and also I'm not going to be talking about remakes, which means that I'm only going to be talking about adaptations from another medium, not from comics itself. This is really a personal choice I'm executing over here because I don't think the spirit of this category is to really talk about things like Alan Moore's revival or rebooting of Swamp Thing or Supreme or Miracle Man for that matter, even though as acts of adaptation, those really stand out. What I'm left with then is largely adaptations from prose and adaptations from movies or television. Although there are, of course, adaptations of epic poetry and folk tales, even opera, available in comics. First of all, I didn't think there were going to be that many adaptations, great adaptations that I could think of. This is perhaps because of a stigma from childhood where anything that was adapted into comics form tended to be very bland and flat, almost a remedial form of here's how you get the classics or here's how you get a great story as a child. And they didn't excite me as other comics did. Today I realize because they weren't interested in the comics medium, and that is why I always thought of adaptations of literature as a far lesser thing than the original. And this is where the question comes in of what makes a great adaptation. The category isn't just an adaptation from another medium, it's a great adaptation from another medium. And for me, there are two ways of looking at it. One could be a great comic that happens to be an adaptation adaptation, or another could be a great work of adapting into the comics medium. Both of these are valid ways of looking at this category, with one key distinction. If you're talking about a great comic that happens to be an adaptation, you don't need to have experienced the original. You don't need to have read the novel or watched the movie that the comic is based on. You know it's a great comic, and the fact that it is an adaptation automatically means it's a great adaptation. But for me to truly judge a great adaptation, I think I need to be familiar with both the original as well as the adapted work that I'm talking about. Now, your selection in the comments below does not have to follow this distinction. That's just the way I've decided to interpret this category. And on top of having encountered both versions, I need a great adaptation to be at least the equal, if not the superior, of the original. What I mean is that the comic has to do in comics form more than what the original does in its original form. That to me is the absolute cherry on the top of a great adaptation. I think any great adaptation will have to strike a unique balance of the original and the new. And achieving that balance while making something greater than the original means keeping all of its strengths and jettisoning the weaknesses and putting new strengths in its place. And the final caveat, I realized that I talked about a number of adaptations on this channel already. And whereas my picks for day 1 and day 2 were both comics that I've celebrated many, many times on this channel and people are quite familiar with my love and passion for day 3, I thought it was time that I select a comic that I may not have talked about before. Which means there's a longish list of things being disqualified. And because of the toughest restriction, that of the adaptation having to be the equal or superior to the original, because of that, there are a number of adaptations that I've enjoyed, but I could never honestly say that they were better than the original thing that they're based on. This would include not just most of the licensed property remakes, the corporate tie-in sort of adaptations that are released, but this also means that perfectly handsome and capable adaptations like the recent To Kill a Mockingbird or Slaughterhouse-5 adaptations, comics that are just absolutely fine by themselves, still don't equal or exceed their originals. So having gone through all of these and many more mental gymnastics, I found myself down to 2 choices. The most obvious choice for me was Rob Davis's adaptation of Don Quixote. By my own standards, though, I would be saying that this is somehow superior to Cervantes's classic. And while that sounds and probably is a foolish thing to say, I think this gets closer than any other comic of a classic that I have read to not only capturing the spirit of the original, but bringing out more in the story. Which makes me think that there's probably a corollary to what makes an adaptation great. It's not simply being superior to the original. Much of that might come from highlighting things that the original already had, but in a completely different way to make them have a completely different effect or weight on the story. That's where I think the Don Quixote adaptation shines. It brings out not just the pathos and the satire of the original, but also the slapstick comedy, the verbal exchanges and silliness, nuances and lighter cultural things that may get lost over the centuries for a classic. And there's a very strong argument to be made that Rob Davis's adaptation of Don Quixote would definitely appeal and be enjoyed by people who would never read the original or a translation of the original. But I also think it contains the capacity to make fans and scholars of Don Quixote even appreciate the cleverness and the humaneness behind the adaptation. And Don Quixote would have been my pick for this if there wasn't one other adaptation for me in which the gap between the original and the comics adaptation was greater. And that is Paul Auster's City of Glass, adapted by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli. I've read the original novella by Paul Auster, dizzying postmodern discussion on many, many things in a sort of literary trapeze act. Parts of it almost reminded me of Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. But for me, that story remained a little too obscure and a little too inaccessible. This adaptation is not a Cliff's Notes simplification of that work, but rather a terrific translation into a form in which the more abstract notions of the prose really come alive for me through the vocabulary of comics in a way that took my breath away. And while nothing is for everyone, this might be a little bit more select and a little bit more niche because of what it asks from the reader, but so does the original prose work that it is based on. The comic instead allows for a greater level of access, at least it did for me, making it a more effective and therefore more significant work. Not what I would consider an easy read, although it can be an extremely entertaining one if you allow yourself to give into it. I did also think that my picks for day 1 and 2 were geared to larger audiences, and just like I wanted more strict rules on myself for day 3, I also thought that I could highlight something that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with, but there's a certain group of you out there, I'm sure, who would just love this. You know, I had a lot of thoughts about adaptations and caveats, and I've left most of them out of this video, and I think it's still a very rambling one anyway. Now that it's your turn to put down into the comments, not just one great adaptation in comics form, but also what you think about adaptations and how you classify adaptations, this discussion can continue over there. And speaking of discussion, the conversation in these comments for these videos has been terrific. I also learned there are a couple of YouTube channels out there doing this 31 days of comics, so check out Chaos and Comics and Comic Crack, two people I know who are working on shorts videos for the entire 31 days of comics. Check out their channels for their picks. I will warn you though that they are much faster than I am, so they're on day 8 or day 11 or something like that. So take this as a spoiler warning in case you don't want to get too far ahead. I know on YouTube sometimes people tag each other to make other videos, but I really don't want to tell people what videos to make. They may have their own plans and schedules, but I'm glad to see people participating. So if you do in any way on YouTube in shorts or long videos, go and play 31 days of comics, let me have your links and I'll put them in my video description. So let's continue the discussion on day 3 while we wait for day 4, which should hopefully be up shortly. This has been For the Love of Comics, playing 31 days of comics. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.